Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the bi-weekly Implementers Office Hours for the Cluster API provider for vSphere. I appreciate you all attending. And if you could, please enter your name in the attendees list. Let me go ahead and post a link to the chat here, so make sure everyone has it. Of course, the notes are listed in the CapV GitHub page for anyone who joins later. So on the agenda today, first on the agenda, hey, good news. We released CapV 05 and 051. This is based on the CAPI V1 Alpha 2 model. And I just want to give a big congratulations to everyone who helped make this happen. And as I said earlier in an internal meeting, unfortunately, one of the key people to making this happen, Yuvraj, who was an intern with our team at VMware, has gone back to school to finish his master's degree, and he's no longer with us, but he was just integral in getting us out the door. So my thanks to him. Besides V1 Alpha 2, one of the pieces of big news with CapV 05, which is on master, the VM reconciliation process has been refactored to support different backend implementations of VM lifecycle management. I encourage people to take a look. There is a new virtual machine service that the V1 Alpha 1 solution for lifecycle management now implements, but we may be providing additional implementations of that might take advantage of new facilities in vSphere 7 that was talked about at VMworld. Quick note, so this has merged. PRs against master are going to once again be subject to passing E to E. We disabled that for a bit when my master was unstable and we couldn't stand up clusters with V1A2, but that's changed. So if you've got outstanding PRs, they might start failing because of maybe there's a new issue, but that's been merged because we want to make sure that master is always passing E to, or PRs aren't breaking the ability to deploy clusters. And I already mentioned about the recordings, but I said that ahead of the recording. So I'm aware that some of these aren't getting uploaded. I was under the impression that when you log in with the official host key and it would auto upload, and that doesn't appear to be the case. So I'm trying to figure out where those are being saved and how to get those uploaded. And finally, if you're building CapV, the CapV makefile has been updated to be more in sync with the other CapV providers. There's nothing too overly dramatic here. Make as a default target now prints help instead of just doing build. And all of the linting related to Go is handled by Golang CI lint. I even created a fixed target that will run that the Golang CI lints fix process. So if you see lint errors, you can try make fix to fix them. I've not removed the old hack check scripts because I've updated them to indicate that they now point to the eponymous make targets, but I did not want to break the old proud jobs that still support the release 04 branch. So we're going to be triaging some outstanding PRs today, making sure people are aware of them and can review them, and then we'll jump into the backlog. Does anyone have any questions about anything I rattled off in the news section? Okay, great. So first of all, CapV using the AutoTree cloud provider.
Yeah, I put that in the agenda.
Yep, I saw. Up to this point, CapV has been deploying clusters with the Entry cloud provider, but for various reasons, we want to move to the AutoTree cloud provider. This is related to an issue I filed earlier today. So I'll let Andrew take over from here. And then Andrew, if you want to incorporate this into that discussion, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, so before going there, it's important to note that Kubernetes itself has deprecated all of the Entry cloud provider integrations, and so the vSphere, the cloud provider vSphere flag, all that stuff is going to go away soon. And so we want to be a little ahead of the game in this effort and switch CAP-V to use the out-of-tree or the external vSphere cloud provider. So that involves turning off the cloud provider integrations in the core control plane components like API server and controller manager, and instead deploying an add-on that does the same things in an external process. And also that means that some of the storage integrations are going to be disabled in tree as well. And so I'll have a follow-up PR that deploys the official vSphere CSI and all that stuff. So this PR essentially does the first part, which is it disables the cloud provider integrations in tree, and then it deploys the vSphere Cloud Controller Manager daemon set on your clusters. So initial testing works. It's worth noting that the PR right now does not, it just deploys the latest version of the Cloud Controller Manager. And so I'd like to have a discussion around how we want to version, like how we want to determine the version of the Cloud Controller Manager, as well as put a comment here. Yeah, actually, I think that's probably the biggest thing that I wanted to discuss is like, how do we want to go ahead and version the CCM that gets deployed on CAP-V? And then on top of that, the discussion around like, how does that change the supported versions of vSphere for CAP-V? So the interesting thing is that the out-of-tree cloud provider, so the out-of-tree cloud provider is required for the vSphere CSI project, and vSphere CSI project only supports vSphere 6.7 U3 and above. And so I think we need to have a large discussion around whether we're okay with that requirement, and if not, how do we want to toggle the in-tree cloud provider into CAP-V so that for older versions of vSphere we can flip back to the in-tree cloud provider.
Or if we even care about versions older than 6.7 U3. So I think that's the first question. Does anyone on this call care about versions of vSphere older than 6.7 U3?
I'm quite sure we have customers who care.
Okay, do we see those? Are they customers that will be using CAP-V or something related to CAP-V?
I don't know, but if you can, I know that we have to take the perspective of being VMware agnostic, where we respect all the distributions of Kubernetes that could land on vSphere. But even for the ones that are VMware products, I believe that PKS on the support matrix specifically calls out support for older than 6.7.
Yeah, and I mean, we had a discussion earlier today where we were talking about CAP-V as part of cluster lifecycle, and it's sort of a bleeding edge, and so it may be okay to require 6.7. Andrew and I were talking about technical challenges of having a switch to enable the old entry provider. And first we thought it actually might be difficult because of the way we generate manifests. Andrew, I don't want to step on you here because I know we're looking into it. I think we came to the realization that there may be an easier way to do it, mapping a config object to a file, but we weren't sure if that was possible because of the entry provider's API server requirement to have that in advance. Anyway, the point is there may be a way to just flip a switch and do this, but Steve, you're saying that PKS calls out support for under 6.7, and I agree 6.5 is still very prevalent among people that use vSphere. I just don't know what the intersection is of people that use vSphere and that would be using CAP-V.
Yeah, so I just did a Google search for the docs for PKS, and I cut and pasted the support matrix. So,
well, and to be clear, I mean, CAP-V and PKS don't have to line up identically. Right. I think it's important to understand that that's what PKS supports, but PKS is a product, and this is an open solution, and I'm trying to understand if there are stakeholders on this call that are currently using CAP-V and anything that they are building, that the thing they're building is going to support anything less than 6.7 U3.
Well, I think I can say yes. At least internally for NetApp, we're using CAP-V and sort of building things out at least internally across a diverse, well, not very diverse, but somewhat diverse set of VMware. And pushing everything to 6.7 U3, I think would be Well, yeah, it's bleeding edge, and it would cause a fair amount of bleeding.
Yeah, I was going to say bleeding edge is going to cut you and cause bleeding. Yeah. No,
Right. I mean,
trying to push.
look, your current, 6.7 plus, I think we could, like currently 6.7 U2 is fine, I think. At least that's what I hear.
I was about to say something really dumb, Nate. I was about to say, well, this is really only the case if you need the cloud provider with storage because it's storage put in the requirement. Do you need storage? And I'm like, wait, net up.
well, we don't necessarily need the vSphere CSI. So, since there is,
and I think
there's the NetApp CSI Trident project that is there. So, I mean, if things can be separated and fragmented out, sort of happy to deal with the bleeding edge case of dealing with different dependencies here and there. But
I'm going to call out Andrew.
6.7 U3 might be a little harder.
Okay. I'm going to call out Andrew Kim here. We chatted earlier, he was going to look up something about, Andrew, you know what I'm talking about, and how they configure the entry provider to map a config file out of the API server. I'm not sure if that's even possible because of the ordering of dependencies there. If we can do that, flipping a switch becomes pretty simple to implement. And we're not trying to ostracize anyone on purpose. It becomes how easy it is to support both because the manifests we generate are what determines which is used. And that means we basically have two sets of templates. We had to have two manifest generation solutions if it would all template based. If we can do this at runtime, then it becomes a lot simpler. So Andrew, I'm going to call you out here on the notes I know we talked about it, but I'm going to document, you're going to look that up.
Yep, that's on my plate.
And just to say, I kind of think for a couple other reasons we at NetApp may be stuck maintaining a fork anyway. But the fewer differences, the better.
Yeah, I think if we know that users definitely are going to be on lower versions, then that's totally I don't think anyone's going to object to supporting that version. But then the question at that point becomes do we default to the out-of-tree provider or do we default to the entry one? And in what scenarios do we deploy the CSI driver and all that stuff? So we need to figure out that story there. But just because we have everyone on the call here, does anyone know if you can make an API call to vCenter to fetch the vSphere version? Is there an API endpoint for that?
Oh yeah, that's actually really easy to get. I can show you how to do that, Andrew.
It's already in the CSI code even in a couple places. So
yeah, you can go straight to the service content to get that, Andrew. I can get that. Steve, I think I interrupted you. What's up?
Yeah, I want to make another point because if you have this big support matrix of every U release of 6.7, I'm not sure we have to go there. The key factors I think are 6.5 versus 6.7, because I think it's fair to say that in general, if you're on some release of 6.7, you should be able to upgrade to the next one. But the chasm of 6.5 to 6.7 is going to have customers who, because of hardware support differences, just can't upgrade to 6.7. There are some Xeon processors, for example, that are fully supported on 6.5, but they cannot be upgraded to 6.7. So if you want to simplify your test matrix, you could probably pick one of 6.7 and one of 6.5, but the issue is whether you support 6.5 at all.
Thank you, and that's important to call out. And Travis brought up an important point. I documented that in the notes, Travis. Please feel free to update the notes about some CAT V users may not want the vSphere CSI deployed. They want to use their own CSI, like Nate said. And Andrew, it didn't occur to me what you were thinking, but I just did as Steve was talking. I'll make a note. We were talking about switching the default to the external provider, but what we may want to do is do a default switch based on whether or not based on the version of vSphere you're using. So if you're 6.7 U3 and above, we default to the external provider. And if you're below, we default to entry. And again, that the ease of doing that at runtime will depend on this issue that Andrew's looking up. But if we can do that, I think that's probably the same choice moving forward for now. Having that default to version of cloud provider be dependent upon the version of vSphere we're talking to. Does that make sense with everyone? To everyone?
Yeah, I think it's a good starting point.
Okay. Anything else you want to bring up for the out-of-tree cloud provider, Andrew?
I think the only other concern is that there is a set of manifests in the cloud provider repo that kind of shows like this is the recommended deployment spec for the cloud provider. And because we're generating the Kubernetes resources inside the CatV controller, I worry a little bit about the config drift that we're going to have there if the cloud provider, changes some RBAC rules or whatever down the road, and we don't necessarily pick up those changes. I'm a little worried about that.
I mean, that's the same problem we have with CAPI right now, which is if we eventually, I think we have to get away from our manifest generation. I mean, you've disliked it all along. And then we were surprised by the CAPI MD book. They went straight away from that, and they go straight from a infrastructural components to here's a step-by-step how you apply manifests. In the manifest generation, we're straight up doing customize against the remote CAPI and KubeADM Bootstrap repos. Right. We could implement something like that for the cloud provider, but I think ultimately what we end up wanting to do is what the MD book does, which is what I think you wanted to do all along, Andrew, which is say, go, if you need these components, go fetch the components you want for the cloud provider at the version that you want them. I mean, ultimately, this goes back to, it's not the CatV provider's job to also provide the UX for CatV, right? There's going to be people that build user interfaces on top of CAPI. There'll be somebody that builds something on top of CatV. So far, we've had this dumb user interface called the manifest generator. But eventually, we should have a rich one with a good experience. And I don't want to spend too much time on the trying to improve the poor man's solution here when we all know its shortcomings and it's not really going to stand the test of time anyway.
Okay.
But I mean, I agree with you. I just think that we don't want to spin our wheels too much on a short-term Band-Aid for a long-term problem.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the stopgap solution I was thinking of is like we can like exec kubectl in the controller and like just that way we have a single source of truth, but that's a little hacky and not sure if the trade-off's worth it.
I'm personally probably not going to approve shell execing right now. I want to get away from that. Yeah,
like it just means that we don't have to manage like the Go types or the Go methods that are pretty much just copies of the manifests in the cloud provider repo. But yeah, I agree. Like the kubectl exec is not a trade-off. It's not a trade-off that's worth making at this point. So we'll just have to make sure that those two are in sync for now.
Yeah. All right. So moving ahead. Go ahead.
No question, Andrew. When do we expect these out-of-tree change get into the class API?
So Andrew has a PR open for this, and I have not had a chance to review it yet. Right here. And so we just re-enabled the E2E testing for master branch, so I'm going to make sure it goes through that, and then we'll see what happens. And then we'll just review the PR like we normally do. I think for now, we're not looking, Andrew, your change isn't looking at setting it as the default, is it? Or it does?
So currently it does, because I just wanted to see if the out-of-tree provider just works.
Okay.
So I did verify it works. So I may end up adapting the PR to do the entry out-of-tree switch based on the vSphere.
Yeah, exactly. If we can do that, then it shouldn't be a problem. But yeah, probably don't want to change it to the default just yet because of the questions around CNS, and that would limit people's ability to do testing, I think, thorough testing. Okay, so moving on, support for external load balancer. Yassine, are you on the call?
Yeah.
Okay.
So just a quick update on this one. I pushed the latest on this work. basically, I refactored the PR to make it a bit more generic, to have multiple load balancer configuration that are possible, and in such a way that we can implement multiple provider. The AWS one being the first that is implemented. So for now, I am able to send up a cluster using the AWS provider.
I'm looking for the Moshe. If you had a chance to join, I'm looking for where you posted a link to your KEP that we discussed. I wanted to call that out because Yassine ended up implementing a version of that. And for people unfamiliar with it, do you have that handy, Moshe? Can I bring that up in my browser?
Let me just check if I have it anywhere on hand.
Yeah, so a while back, for people not familiar, we discussed implementing load balancer support on VMC and AWS, and Yassine took the task, and Moshe brought up, hey, this is actually a more general issue, and maybe we don't want to be opinionated about what load balancers are supported. And I noted that, hey, we can't even do AJ testing until we have a load balancer. So Moshe said that, yeah, fine, let's go ahead and do it for VMC and AWS with the understanding we may refactor later. Yassine being, awesome, he decided, hey, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it right. And so he implemented a version of this where we actually have Yassine implemented. Yassine, you want to speak to this? Because
Yeah.
I don't.
So yeah, the idea is to implement a control loop that is dedicated to reconciliate the load balancers. So whenever a cluster is created, depending on if a load balancer configuration being set or not, the load balancer controller will reconciliate and create a load balancer that will be the control plane endpoint for this cluster. And depending on the provider specified into the vSphere cluster, the control loop will use this the work plugin to reconcile the cluster.
Is somebody making some weird clicking noise? If they can mute themselves. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm really anxious to review this. I haven't had a chance to dig in deep on this, but the idea is that we're basically using CapV, the proof of concept, this KEP, and quite frankly, like we believe. I mean, I really appreciate Moshe doing this. I really think this is kind of amazing, and not so much equally actually that that he did this, but that it doesn't already exist, because it really makes sense that we have a separate controller and really separate service to add support for just any third-party load balancer as the endpoint for new clusters via CAPI or to services, and this can really satisfy either. And so, to keep things simple, Yassine implemented a version of it for VMC and AWS for CapV in CapV. But this could very much just live outside of CapV in its own repository as, here's how you do load balancers on VMC and AWS. And CapV could use it the same way it uses the vSphere cloud provider or the KubeADM bootstrapper. So I'm really anxious to start testing this. So I really do encourage others to take a look and provide their feedback.
Yeah, just an FYI on this. This is generic enough to live out of tree, but
Yep.
The reason I discussed this with Andrew to proceed in tree is mostly for the overhead that out of tree will bring us, especially that the design that Moshe is working on will target V1 Alpha tree. So we'd have eventually support for out of tree load balancer providers in V1 A3. So that's why I decided to go with in-tree first.
100%.
Yeah, I think that was the right call. Here's Moshe's original issue on CAPI. I'd asked him to create it inside of CAPI instead of CapV because it made the most sense to be there. But I think this is a really good opportunity to say, like, look, not only is this CAP a good idea, but here it is working for CapV. And it's a way easier to discuss something with a proof of concept than it is just generically. And we need this, regardless of anything else. We need a way to do HA testing, and this gives us that on our test platform. So it's kind of serendipitous that we all needed it at once. But yeah, I'm really interested in this, and I've updated the original issue here, 468, with the, here we go, with the includes link to CAPI.
While we're on the load balancers, I'm assuming this is going to be pretty easy to port over to NSXT. My question is, what type of testing infrastructure is there for NSXT?
We don't have good well, we're on VMC, which does have NSXT, but they do not have NSXT load balancers on their roadmap currently. They're not exposed to us. We're subject to the policy API. As soon as they upgraded us to, I created our VMC org literally 3 weeks before they upgraded everybody to NSXT. And so I'm like, great. And we were on NSXV for a year because I didn't want to recreate all of our infrastructure. It wasn't an in-place upgrade. They finally did do an in-place upgrade. Like, great, we finally have load balancers. I can implement NSXT load balancing support in CAPV. They don't include load balancers on NSXT on VMC. So we don't have the ability to do that testing on VMC. Now, certainly at VMware, we have the ability to do it with other infrastructure. Hui and Jiatong have been doing testing on some of our internal platforms, and we could potentially implement something like that there. But with this new model, it becomes way easier to implement that, though, I would think, right,
Yeah.
Yassine?
Yeah, so the idea is just to implement two function reconcile and delete. Each provider has to implement these, and it should be enough.
Yeah, and I know that with vSphere 7, you know, and everything they talked about at VMworld, there'll be some interesting things we can think about doing too. So, yeah.
Is there interest to implement an NSXT provider for this case?
I mean, I already have an issue out there for NSXT support. And honestly, the only reason that we don't have NSXT support at this point, I would have done it the moment I started on CAPV if VMC had support for it. So Hui, if you or anyone else, I know Thomas wanted to give this a shot, and I told him to possibly wait to V1A2 as well as NCP 2.5. But with this new LB design, if you wanted to take a stab at it or anyone else did, please feel free to assign this to yourself.
Yeah, so I definitely looks impossible to for me or Jiatong to do it because internally we already built up these tests based on the internal platform, which has an NSXT, I believe, already. Although I'm not sure who is, besides we can internally test that, who is interested to either external user or consumer.
So I might be doing an NSXT implementation. So either NSXT or F5. I'm a bit on the fence at the moment as to which one is going to make it into my environment. So one or the other I'll be able to test.
Can you, Moshe, can you sync up with Hui and KK Slack? And once you figure it out, if it's F5, let him know so that we don't duplicate work here.
Sure.
Sure. Yeah, we don't want to duplicate. Although I can always work with Marshall to if you can implement, I can always kind of help you to also validate if you need another.
Yeah, I think that would be great too. We could do additional validation inside of our VMware infrastructure because we won't have the ability to run CI on this on VMC at the moment. But I do touch base with them about once a month and gently remind them it would be great if we had load balancers on VMC. I understand why they don't. It would be sort of an additional networking nightmare to support that, but with sort of a public, on-prem in the cloud solution, but it'd be great for us. So yeah, I don't want to, we're got 30 minutes left. I want to kind of get into the triaging backlog. Does any other questions around the load balancer? Okay, so I want to start triaging the backlog. So the first one that I have here is something that I don't know if he's on the call. Let me close some of these here. Ralph, did you make it today? Okay, so Ralph created this issue a couple of days ago, and actually wasn't even sure if it was an issue at first. I said, hey, can you send us your manifests? And then I realized it is an issue, and it's just crazy. I wouldn't even call it an edge case. It was just a crazy use case that I don't think anyone really considered. But I don't know that there's a great solution for it. I have a PR for it, but I don't like the PR. Basically, this issue is if you specify the control plane endpoint in your manifest in advance, this is all V1A2, in advance, it gets overridden with the IP address of the control plane node. And why is that? Well, it's because your cluster controller is supposed to update itself with its API endpoints. And then the CAPI controller, or actually the kubeadm bootstrap controller, reads that, and then if the control plane endpoint is empty, will update the control plane endpoint with one of your API endpoints. But this presumes that the thing responsible for creating the cluster controller is responsible for creating the control plane endpoint. Because how else is it supposed to know what to set as its API endpoints if it's using a load balancer? So Ralph created a load balancer in advance. He wanted to test CAPV with a load balancer, and it should work because it's all handled by the bootstrapper provider now. But he found that the load balancer endpoint was being overridden by the IP of the first control plane node. And I outlined the issue here, but it's the case that the only way to fix it, and this is what my PR does, and again, I'm not happy with it. And I think I've got a comment in it about why I'm not happy. But the only way to fix it is to assume knowledge that of the bootstrap provider. Right now, we know the bootstrap provider is the kubeadm bootstrapper. But it doesn't have to be. So to get the control plane endpoint, to determine if one is set, you have to read the machine's bootstrap ref and get that resource and know what type that resource is, that it contains a control plane endpoint, and know how to read it. And that's what this does. If a control plane has a kubeadm config resource, it reads the control plane endpoint out of it, and if one's there, and it uses that as the API endpoint. Again, I'm not happy with the fix because it violates the separation of the separation model that the V1 Alpha 2 employs. We're not separation of concern model. The infrastructure provider isn't really supposed to know anything about the bootstrap provider, only that it provides a bootstrap data string, and that's it. And we know how we can get that object, that resource, but to get it assumes that if you look at the type string, you know exactly what go type to unmarshal it into and what fields to read. And we can do all that right now because there's just one. But moving forward, I don't like this as a solution. And so I did CC Chuck and Jason on this. And Jason's like, yeah, it's interesting. And we discussed about the possibility of maybe setting an annotation on the cluster so that if a control plane endpoint is set in advance, then, or if it's set at all, then the bootstrap provider will set an annotation on the cluster with the control plane endpoint so that your cluster reconciler can look at that. But even that isn't perfect because there's a race condition about what you read first. I don't know what the long-term solution is, but in the meantime, there's an outstanding PR to fix this. It's just an interesting use case, and maybe others have encountered it. Yeah.
Maybe I just have a basic question. I am not sure I understand it. So if Ralph provisioned the load balancer pre-deploy cluster API, then how that load balancer be configured? We basically tie the IP.
You can set the IP. You can set static IPs on the machines. That's what he did.
He said static IP for the master. Okay.
Yep. Yeah. By the way, I saw a question come in via email. I need to respond to her, and I'm going to file an issue. I haven't filed this issue. She asked, how do you set static IPs on machine deployments? The simple answer is you don't. using machine deployment, you're using DHCP. There's no great way to do static IPs on machine templates today. And so in Ralph's case, he was just doing he wasn't using a machine deployment because there's no good way to do that. You want static IPs, you have to use individual machines. Although for the worker nodes, they could have been dynamic because we really only care about load balancing the API endpoint anyway. I think we talked this next issue to death, the raising the minimum required version, so I'm not going to rehash it here. Let's see, let me actually bring up the milestone, see if I have anything else in the 5.2. One open, which is, yeah, that one, okay. And then do we have anything in the 4.2? Nothing open. So let's start with our, we've talked about that, so let's just go to issues.
I'm just going to say something right here that I can't say anything definite right now about the load balancer and setting the IPs in advance or about using static IPs, but that's something that I and other people at NetApp are going to be fighting with over the next weeks to months. So
I honestly,
involved.
Yeah. I honestly thought about implementing in CapV the notion of an IP pool so that your templates could. Yeah, you've done this. Yeah. So yeah,
it's in process. We'll see how it works and let you know.
Stay in contact because it sounds like we're working on the same issue.
Yeah.
All right. So command line version output. I responded to Ralph. He said he would like for the manager to involve. Okay, well, Cluster Cuddle, by the way, for those who aren't aware, is no longer our concern at all. It is built and maintained by CAPI. So I think what, he only put Cluster Cuddle. I thought he meant the manager. So I may reassign this to CAPI. Never mind. I thought he meant the manager using Cluster Cuddle as an example. So I'm going to reassign to CAPI. All right, that's easy. Multi-tenant manager support. This is kind of a longer one. I don't know if we want to bike shed on this right now, but basically what happens when multiple tenants want to use CapV as a single management solution. Honestly, this is my recommendation to people right now. One CapV management cluster per tenant, because either I hear that secrets and namespaces aren't security boundaries, or I see them being used as those, and they can't be both. It's either you don't think they're security boundaries or you are, or they are, and you have to embrace one or the other. And the prevailing wisdom seems to be that namespaces and secrets shouldn't be relied on as security boundaries, and secrets aren't that secret. So since management clusters aren't that difficult to stand up, my recommendation to people right now is if you need multi-tenancy, just deploy additional management clusters, one per tenant. But I encourage people to address the issue here on the issue. I opened it 2 weeks ago, so please add to the conversation. Yeah, I don't want to bike shed here because I think that could be a pretty big discussion, but know that it's out there. And let me make a note here in the notes. Did I move that? Yeah, okay. All right, so support for maintenance mode. Siddharth, are you on the call? All right, I'm assigning to Siddharth because he's not on the call to say no. No, this was something we had in V1A1. It'll be very easy to reintroduce support for in V1A2. Essentially, if an annotation is on a machine, because remember V1A1, we had CRUD series of operations. In V1A2, we have reconcile, normal, and delete. And even before that, there's really just reconcile. So if an annotation is on a machine that says maintenance mode, we don't reconcile it. And basically, it's so that people that are wanting to mess with machines manually, they don't have the controller start doing, if you power off the machine, the controller is just going to power it back on because it's going to see it's powered off and it should be powered on. So if you put a machine in maintenance mode, this was, by the way, this was also a compromise because people needed, it was either this or there was very real possibility people were going to be issuing pull requests to update the Kubernetes resource state intent the intended state from vSphere. Like, we can't accept that. So can we do maintenance mode as a compromise? So, Kubernetes manages these resources, but you need to do something with them temporarily. You can put a machine in maintenance mode. So I'm assigning this to Siddharth because that was his one originally. It should be easy enough to implement. So that's 527. Let me add that. That's the version 1. Let me add this. So maintenance mode. All right. So support for NSXT. We discussed that. Apply VM tags based on machine label prefix. So this is an interesting one. And some of these came from a gap analysis that we did with some other solutions to see what Cat V doesn't have versus what the other solutions offer. And they were suggesting that it would be nice to do introduce the ability to produce labels based on tags and values. Create tags and values on the VMs based on an understood label prefix. So if we had a label like this, tag dash, then this becomes our tag inside of vSphere, and this becomes the value. So we could automatically apply tags and values to VMs based on these labels and machines. Is anyone interested in doing this? All right, well, I am going to go ahead and assign it priority.
You can assign it to me because it's going to link back. This is probably related to how we want to do zone and region support with tags.
It's exactly that. I can update you more offline. Yeah, that's exactly what it comes back to. It's also the multi-tenant. A lot of this comes out of that discussion we had. So maintenance mode, tags and labels. Okay, enable the vSphere Cloud Controller Manager. We've talked about that. So this is one that I created a while ago, and I'm going to self-assign it unless somebody else wants it. Jai Tong might be a good person for this if he's interested. I don't know if he's on the call because of all the work y'all been doing with the build pipeline, but I would like to produce a document that identifies the minimum set of vSphere permissions required for Cat V, because right now we've just been operating with you're the admin user, but that probably isn't required. Maybe it is. I don't know.
I think it's not. I don't know the details. We have looked at this and we have trimmed down some things.
I'm not going to assign it to you because it doesn't sound like you're too eager. But if you've trimmed it down,
thank you for not assigning it to me.
Can you add to it?
Yeah, I'll make a note and see if I can get some information there.
Waiting more evidence here. Put that. I'm going to at least CC you.
Yeah.
What's your GitHub name, Nate?
NTFRNZ. Also, there's a project from Jordan that might help, which converts audit logs to RBAC.
That's done what?
It's a project from Jordan. Basically, it converts audit logs to RBAC rules.
Oh. But this is specifically for vSphere permissions. Are you talking about vSphere RBAC?
I was talking more about Kubernetes RBACs.
Yeah, I don't know that Kubernetes RBAC is necessarily what we're talking about here.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it's about the vSphere roles and permissions that you need to be able to do things like create virtual machines or update their, reconfigure them, and what permissions you might need in a data store. Here's an interesting one. A lot of times people forget that you need the permission to deploy the VM from the template because it's not something they think about, things like that.
Yeah, so I've been hit by this as well. So I'd definitely be interested in the solution to this. I don't know about
I'm seeing you, Moshe, just so you can see it. I love that how you came in there at the end. The solution. Yeah, me too. We all would. All right. Well.
Hey, Andrew, do you want to assign to Jatong? I can communicate to him.
Yeah, if you want me to do that, I will. I wasn't going to do it without at least you saying that, because persimmons. Okay. Yeah, let me. What is it?
Is W? J. Never mind. I can.
You can just assign it to him, I think.
Yeah, I can just assign
Jtong W.
it.
What is it?
Jtong W.
Like that?
Yep.
All right. Update manifest. Okay, so this one, I'm not sure if this is still an issue. I assigned it to Travis a while back. I think it was an issue of the manifest image not being updated on build, or Yassine. I think maybe it was possibility that you weren't manually pulling latest, because if you had a copy locally, it wasn't going to pull it. I think it may have just been a stale image that you were running locally. So I did note that, hey, Travis, hey, do you need help? But Yassine, also, could you check to see if this is still an issue, please?
Okay, I'll double check, especially now with the view on F2.
Yeah. So let me. So this one, I reached out to them today. You said a while back that you were going to look more into this. I don't know if you had. I pinged you earlier on it to see if you had looked into it. Did you get any more information on this?
Sorry, I didn't. I need to.
That's fine. I just wanted to, this may also no longer be an issue. This was about a month ago, and then that's ancient in Kubernetes time. So let me also, can you possibly confirm whether or not this is still an issue? Yeah, it's just ancient in Kubernetes time, isn't it? So I thought that was actually a different one. Let's see. So Andrew, E to E coverage. This is actually going to be something that I start to promote pretty heavily in the channel. About let's do more with maybe mocks, see if we could do more with the vCenter simulator, anything like that. And you are working on this, and I suggested it may be even useful for you to move this work to CAPI. I don't think it's necessarily directly related to CAP-V, but I was curious if there's a status update on it.
No, I've been mostly working on the external cloud provider work, but this is next on my to-do list.
All right, so
unless something higher priority comes up.
Gotcha.
So, like, would you prioritize that over like the tagging feature?
Yeah, I think so, because I think you've done a lot of the initial work on the E to E coverage. Or at the very minimum, I would prioritize elevating it into CAPI where you could, because then maybe it could get resourced by that project and not be limited to CAP-V's resources.
Okay. It doesn't, like, intuitively, like, it wouldn't make sense to put it in CAPI, because the resources we would generate for the tests would be provider specific. So I'm not sure how it would be in CAPI, but yeah, I can look into that afterwards. Like, feel free to keep it assigned to me.
Yeah, that's true. Let's talk about that, because I know some of the work that Tim is doing on cluster ADM is supposed to be at provider agnostic. So if we can figure out a way to do that, then maybe we can figure out a way to feed provider specific resources into an agnostic framework for the testing. So it really just needs to drive the input and match the output, or drive the input and then match the expected state, which from a CAPI resource perspective doesn't actually have to be vSphere specific. I mean, because we can check on the state of clusters of machines from a CAPI resource level without having to know about the provider that fulfilled those obligations. So go ahead.
So like a few months ago, I added basically the example provider implementation in the CAPI space, but that's for the purpose of an integration test. And I think that's still there, but that example provider does very minimal things, and it's really hard to test some useful thing with mockup.
So that's fair. I know that they're going to start putting a lot more energy and effort into CapD as a reference implementation, which may be useful for doing testing. But even if the EDA framework that you're working on, Andrew, or we, ends up, or your sample provider, even if the framework ends up like V1A1 cluster cuddle, where everybody has to build some version of it themselves because we have to feed our own types and expectations and match expected output, it may still be possible to build the framework in a way that it's a composable library that you can then pull in and feed your input into it and handle the output, handle the result of the tests and determine whether something's successful or fails based on a provider specific expectation. So I wouldn't completely discount that this could be useful for others and out of hand. So we're running out of time. There's one, so I'll go here because I actually I was triaging these earlier. I asked Jim to please determine whether or not we still care about this because it's no longer an issue with V1A2. And I'm not sure what people's expectations are on V1A1. We are going to be doing a 0.42 release, but I'm not sure, additional V1A1 releases will be based purely on when people require them or if there are critical fixes. So I'm waiting for Jim to respond on providing a custom query string for V1A1 API endpoint. Otherwise, I'm focusing purely on V1A2. And then there was one more I wanted to get to before we're out of time. So Sajid filed this too long ago, meaning I haven't followed up with. I actually did follow up via email and Slack, which is why I haven't here. But I asked him first, was it still reproducible in V1A2? He had a 48-minute long clone attempt, and I said, well, that's actually a problem with your vCenter. That's if a clone's taking 48 minutes, you got vCenter issues. But he raised another interesting point. It did not, the cluster cuddle did not pick up for where it left off. Now, if you're not familiar with CapV, the way it works is when you create a VM, so when you create an instance in AWS or GC, you immediately get a unique piece of identifying information that you can use to track that instance across its entire lifetime. With vSphere, when you clone a template, you get a task reference. Now, part of the spec you use to clone the template can include a custom piece of information called the instance UUID. And we do set that, and that's how we're able to find that VM. But what happens when you create a new machine using CapV is it clones a template, and then it sets a task ref on the back end. And when it comes back in through reconciliation, it immediately says, hey, is there an outstanding task associated with this machine? If there is, and that task is still running, we just requeue. Can't do anything, running task. Once it's finally up, once that task is completed, we attempt to find that machine based on its instance UUID. So if you reran cluster cuddle, the instance UUID is going to be different because the seed ID actually comes from the machine's UUID. And obviously that changes after the pivot, but we don't care because we only need it pre-pivot, and then we store it as part of our machine spec anyway. But there is the potential to try to resume a deployment if we used some type of friendly information for an initial instance UUID, or they were able to specify that manually as part of their machine ref if they knew to do it. I just don't know if people think that that is a valid use case, resuming a failed deployment. I would argue it's not. Like it's not worth the time and trouble to go through to deal with this. Because I think if it takes 48 minutes to clone something, you have a problem with your system. But I don't know everything, so maybe there is a valid use case, and 48 minutes isn't abnormal in some situations. I mean, what do people think? Any comments? All right. Sounds to me like no one thinks 48 minutes is normal, and no one is volunteering that they think that we should be able to resume a failed deployment. So I am going to wait for Sujit to respond to this, and then just deal with it from there. Yeah. I've not finished triaging the rest of these issues. That's fine. We've actually got to, that's funny, we got to exactly where I finished triaging today out of the call. There is actually there are a couple of issues related to Windows support. People want to know when are we going to support Windows. And a lot of that now is more up to CAPI. We no longer build cluster cuddle. That's on CAPI. Machine images are now handled on the image builder repository. So I've directed people to that to file support for Windows machine images there. But yeah, that's the only other series of issues that I saw. I want to thank everybody for their time. Does anyone have any remaining questions, concerns they want to discuss? All right. Well, thank you for your time, and I'll update these issues.
I have one concern.
Yeah.
I noticed that you didn't star the cluster API for vSphere repo on GitHub.
Wait, what? I haven't? Oh.
All right. I'm good, thanks.
Yeah, that is a problem. Now we're at 78. Yeah, tell all your friends to star them. Like, my memcon repo has more stars than CatV, and there's a company behind CatV. Like, this is just an in-memory network stack for Go I wrote. Like, it should.
You didn't star that one either.
It's my own repository. It's like voting for yourself. That's fine. I'm not gonna star my own repo. It's like voting for yourself in a high school election or something. Anyway, all right. Well, thanks everyone. I appreciate it, and I will work out why these things aren't getting uploaded. Thanks.